Thank you, members of the class of 2017, President Dooley, Provost DeHaze, Chair Cotton, Chair Folks, and the other members of the Rhode Island Board of Education, and thank you, Governor of the great state of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo. I'm honored to be here on this very special day. I think she just left, but it's live TV. We do this all the time. Many years ago, I was sitting in these stands looking forward to a celebratory dinner and a drink or two with family and friends, because that's what today is. It's a chance to look back at the years you've had to grow into yourself here at the University of Rhode Island. A chance to look around at the friends you've made and the parents who've supported you every step of the way. In fact, let's give those parents a hand. Another round of applause. They've earned this day as much as you have. But also, having been in your shoes, I know that while many of you may have all figured it out, with a great job lined up or a graduate school acceptance in hand, I know that many of you may be, as I was, looking at the future with some uncertainty as to what lies ahead. And for you especially, I'd like to share with you some of my story and what I've learned along the way since leaving the University of Rhode Island. Now, some of you might have glanced at my biography in these commencement materials, learning that I left URI and I started working on Wall Street. Then after nearly 20 years of a pretty successful career in the United States and abroad, I decided to make a change. In 2009, I began working as an unpaid intern at CNN and was then hired as a production assistant. Within a few years, I was part of Anderson Cooper's team that won an Emmy for our coverage of the devastating earthquake in Haiti, and then a Peabody for the reporting that we did on the nearly 200 girls kidnapped by the West African terror group Boko Haram. By 2015, fewer than 6 years after entering the field of journalism, I was asked to fill in for Charlie Rose on CBS This Morning. But my acceptance to URI was a key moment in my life. I've always felt that Rhodey's acceptance of a high school kid who was considered different by many people, even in my own family, who were sitting over there, I might add, in some ways reflected the character of this union's smallest but mightiest state. Rhode Island had the privilege of having the first president of the United States, George Washington, once remark, "Rhode Island still perseveres in that impolitic, unjust, and one might add, without much impropriety, scandalous conduct, which seems to have marked all of her public councils of late." Yeah, but I was very different back then. Some of you with a more sophisticated bent, perhaps those of you graduating with a psychology degree, might have called me an introvert or an observer. Everyone else simply said, dork. And perhaps that's what I was. How much of a dork? Well, in 10th grade, there was a girl who lived down the street from me, and we'd walk home together every day after school, and I thought she was the most beautiful girl in school. I was far too shy to ever say anything to her about it, but one day, she walked by my house, and she asked if she could come in. Being a true dork, I told her girls are not allowed in the house when my parents are not home. Yeah, my parents know that. Remember, I was in high school when I said this to her. She said, "How will they know?" So she marched right up the driveway, and next thing, we're hanging out on my couch, and at one point, she leans in real close, and she says, "What do you want to do?" And I looked into her eyes, not yet, and I say, "I would like to show you my mint condition Batman comic from 1970. It's the first one written by Neil and drawn by Neil Adams, who's really taken Batman in a new direction. And she didn't appreciate the grandeur of Neil Adams' pencils, but if she had one day, who knows, I might have sold it to buy her a nice engagement ring. So, all right, wait, but a few months later, I get that acceptance to the University of Rhode Island, a chance at a new start, a chance to broaden my horizons and to reinvent myself. So sophomore year, the reinvented me was home for the summer. And I run into that young woman at a party, and she jokingly says, "You want to show me your comic book collection again?" Let's simply say by that point, I had learned a few new things at the University of Rhode Island. Remember what Washington said about Rhode Island? Scandalous conduct. Translation, go Rams. The University of Rhode Island transformed me. It changed me. It was a glorious metamorphosis, but it would not be the last. And more importantly, here at the University of Rhode Island, I learned a great many other things. My childhood interests of comic books and Star Wars gave way to a passion for the history of the world, the politics of civilization, and the philosophies that guide humanity. I was transformed. My professors and books and classmates showed me a new and vast world, and I began to dream of traveling that world and sharing what I learned with others. I set my sights on a future in journalism. And here at URI, I began writing for the Good 5 Cent Cigar. I hosted a weekly show on WRIU. I joined Army ROTC, Go Army. I learned to think critically on the Student Senate. And I had classes such as the theory of nonviolence with Professor Art Stein in political science classes, and in my history of race relations with Professor Robert Weisbord. So many amazing professors. And I'm reminded of an interview I did with Neil deGrasse Tyson once, who told me that the education you receive in class is just a foundation to absorb and comprehend the voluminous knowledge acquired elsewhere. And as I built this foundation at URI, I became intrigued by a maxim that's generally attributed to St. Augustine. The key to immortality is living a life worth remembering. A life worth remembering. So I graduate from URI. Now you have to understand something. My parents, as you've heard, are immigrants, and like all parents, they want you to get a great education, and they are here today, and I thank them for their support. But when it comes to a career, there are only really three that matter generally: the law, medicine, and engineering. Journalism, oh, you mean writing? And I'm not doing the accent, Mom, so yeah. That's a hobby. That's a wonderful hobby. In any case, I struggled to find a job in journalism. After graduation, I moved to New York City with some of my URI fraternity brothers, and I didn't realize it then that I would have had a better chance of getting a job as a reporter if I had moved to Fargo, North Dakota, or some other smaller market in this country. But my roommates were all working on Wall Street, and they encouraged me to apply for a job in finance. Now, I learned a lot at URI, but business was not one of those subjects. I was interested in Nelson Mandela, not J.P. Morgan. I told my roommate, I don't know anything about finance. His reply, you don't need to know anything about finance. And there you have it. That's all you need to know about the financial crisis of 2008 and every financial crisis going back to October of 1929. But anyway, they hired me, and I remember thinking, I'll only do this for a few years to make some money, then I'll go back to writing and I'll be a journalist. Next thing I knew, some 19 years had passed. I had lived in Europe, traveled to Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and I'll admit it, it was great. I was good at it. Who knew? I'd like to think that some admissions officer at the University of Rhode Island had an idea, had a premonition, and that they knew. But as I neared my 40s, I started to realize that even though I was fairly successful, I was by now a managing director at the second largest investment firm in the world, I had not lived up to my own definition of a meaningful existence. I was not living a life worth remembering. A life worth remembering. Once I was with a colleague in Stockholm, having just read a story about the civil war in Sri Lanka, and I was lamenting how no one with the stature of past statesmen could end the violence. And even as I discussed what I had learned via the courageous reporting of a Sri Lankan reporter, I realized that I wanted to know more, and I wanted others, like my board colleague, to know more. So instantly, at that moment, I know it's hard to believe, but I decided at that moment to make a change. I tried to get a media job as an entry-level production assistant, but many people thought I was going through a midlife crisis. They thought there's no way a Wall Street executive would take a job that is involved with getting coffee and making copies and pulling archive video. And I realized to get my foot in the door, I had to go back to school. So nearly 20 years after my last class here at URI, I was back in a classroom studying for a master's degree in journalism, which led to an unpaid internship at CNN. And I always joke that it took me 60 grand to get an unpaid internship at CNN, but that's what it took. And I was starting at the very bottom. But was it the bottom? I was working for the legendary foreign correspondent and URI alumni, Christian Amonpour, but I was 38 years old, 18 years older than my fellow interns. Now, right before my internship, Anderson Cooper came to speak to our class, and I asked him a lot of questions, and he told me that I should come up and see him when my internship started, and we did, and we talked, and the topic of Haiti came up, and he loved the country. He had been there many, many times reporting from there, but we were lamenting the fact that the world really wasn't that interested in what was going on in that country. He asked me to send him my resume, and I did. Didn't really hear back. 2 months later, though, January 12th, 2010, a devastating 7.0 magnitude earthquake struck the island. I got a phone call from Anderson Cooper's executive producer, Charlie Moore. He said, AC is on the last flight out to Haiti. Do you want to join his team as a production assistant? I think Charlie was still holding the phone when I skidded into the departures lounge. I was told to pack for 3 days. No one yet knew how much damage the earthquake had done. We flew overnight, and we landed at 6 a.m. At first, driving in from the airport, things didn't look too bad. We began to hope. But as we rounded a corner on the outskirts of the capital city of Port-au-Prince, we saw it. We jumped out of the pickup truck and walked over to the median. A small white blanket lay on the hot asphalt. It held a little baby, less than a year old. It was the first dead body I had ever seen. Over the next 30 days, when we were in Haiti, I would see many more. By some estimates, the 2010 earthquake ultimately killed between 220,000 and 316,000 human beings. 300,000 were injured, 1.5 million more were displaced. A few days after the earthquake, our team discovered the site where the Haitian government was burying bodies in mass graves. It was a hilly area overlooking the ocean. Under different circumstances, there'd be a resort there. Under different circumstances, happy people drinking fruity cocktails watching the sunset. Instead, there were 1,000-foot deep, man-made craters in the ground filled to the brim with men, women, children, the old, the young, the rich, and the poor. We watched as an earth mover rumbled up to one of those miserable ditches, then with that banal beeping sound that you just heard there, emptied its dreadful cargo of mangled humanity. And amid this horror, there were moments of triumph. 5-year-old Manly Elise was buried under the rubble for 5 days. His father had lived for a few days next to him, telling him to not be afraid, until, as Manly told us later, his father stopped talking. An 80-year-old woman was rescued several days after the earthquake in the belly of a church, but more often than not, those of us reporting on this horror had to bear witness to the pain and suffering of a people left to their own devices. I remember the day Manushka Polinis asked us to help rescue her young daughter, Leica, and other children trapped under a daycare center. The Los Angeles County Fire Department was on the ground to help, and they began a rescue operation. I was asked to call out in French to the kids below. A firefighter and I crawled into the collapsed building, and as soon as I called out, I heard what sounded like a call for help. But 9 hours later, after the echolocators couldn't detect signs of life and the rescue dog could not pick up a scent, the fire department called off the rescue. The chief asked me to translate to Manushka that after so many days trapped without food or water, Leica had probably died. You know what Manushka did? She thanked us. She thanked the reporters that were there. She told us that she was going to go to church on Sunday and work with her neighbors to try and rescue Leica, whom she believed, along with the other children, was still alive. All night long, I tried to convince myself that I hadn't really heard that voice, that I had imagined it somehow, wanting this child to be alive, wanting to help rescue her, wanting to fulfill my destiny of living a life worth remembering. And come morning, I was pretty convinced that I hadn't heard that voice, until our producer, Charlie, played the video of me shouting to the survivors, and then on that tape, you could hear a faint but undeniable, "Help me." So after all of that devastation, by October of 2011, I had been reporting with Anderson Cooper, and I had been promoted to an on-air correspondent at CNN, and I was living that life that I had dreamed about all those years ago, and it's ironic that careers are sometimes born in the midst of tragedy. Anderson Cooper had become my champion at the network, and he remains one today, a mentor like no other. I was asked to become CNN's West Africa correspondent in Lagos, Nigeria, and then one night in April of 2014 in a village in a remote region of northeastern Nigeria called Chibok, more than 200 girls were kidnapped in the dead of night by the ISIS-affiliated terror group Boko Haram. And those girls were doing what you're all doing here, so blessed to be doing, which is getting an education. Lately, some have taken to calling media reporting fake news. The President of the United States, writing on Twitter, quote, "The fake news media, failing New York Times, NBC News, ABC, CBS, CNN, is not my enemy, it is the enemy of the American people." I've heard such sentiments expressed by others. When those 200 girls were kidnapped, I spent 15, 16 hours a day reporting on their plight, how their families were doing, how Nigeria's government seemed unable or unwilling to bring them home to their loved ones. Then after days of giving voice to those victims, Nigeria's Minister of Defense released a statement through a spokesman, and I and dozens of other reporters who were covering this story were told that the Nigerian military had found and rescued the girls and returned them home to their loving families. The spokesman called me and he said, "Vlad, stop vilifying the Nigerian government. Stop vilifying the military." I was told I was spreading propaganda, delivering fake news. Focus on the good things the Nigerian government is doing to fight terrorism, to unify the country. But here's the thing, the government was lying. Within an hour, the families of those kidnapped girls called me, and they said, "Why are you telling the world that the girls have been rescued? No girl has been rescued. Please don't be fooled by what they're telling you. Please help us." So you tell me who was delivering fake news. A total of 115 journalists died in 2016 simply for doing their jobs, according to the annual report compiled by the International Safety Institute. The group Reporters Without Borders says nearly 3/4 of the journalists killed in 2016 were victims of deliberate, targeted violence. Deliberate, targeted. If you look closely at the desk where Scott Pelley, the anchor of the CBS Evening News, sits, you might see a set of framed pictures. They are the 13 journalists who have died in the line of duty for CBS News, going back to George Polk, who was killed covering the Civil War in Greece in 1948. And you might recognize his name because there is a prestigious award named after him, but the others are not well known. But Scott keeps them there as a reminder. He once said, "Every night on our broadcasts, somebody, somewhere, has risked his or her life to cover the news." So who risks their lives to do something that is fake? Between April and June of 2014, journalists on the ground, the majority of them Nigerian and African journalists, risking far more than those of us with Western news outlets, dug in and kept reporting on the government's lack of transparency and corruption, and something happened. A world that might otherwise have ignored the fate of hundreds of poor Nigerian girls in a tiny village began to respond. Former British Prime Minister David Cameron, First Lady Michelle Obama, and beyond, people around the world began to publicly demand that the Nigerian government bring back our girls. In April 2014, 276 girls were abducted. The pressure has continued, and as of today, 163 have returned. 113 more are still missing. And since 2013, more than 10,000 Nigerians have been killed by Boko Haram. And an activist in Nigeria once told me, "Vlad, after Boston was attacked by terrorists in April of 2013, President Obama visited the city and met with the victims' families and their survivors. In 2013, more than 1,000 Nigerians were killed in over 100 attacks by Boko Haram. Most of those in those communities rarely ever see a governor, let alone the president of the country. But they see journalists who take what they've seen, what they've witnessed, the voices of those they've spoken to, and they put this all in front of those countries' leaders to hold them accountable in the face of the world so that you and everyone else with access to a free and fair press will know that knowledge may not bring someone home from the clutches of a terrorist. It certainly won't bring someone back from the dead, but if remembering them, we honor them. In a sense, we immortalize them. In some ways, journalists become the key to their immortality. So back to that saying that so motivated me when I was first here at the University of Rhode Island. I've come to realize that, yes, the key to some kind of immortality is living a life worth remembering. But I've come to see that it isn't just about my own life being memorable. It's about being the conduit for the stories of others. In essence, being their key. And I've further seen that immortality, at least in the eyes of another, comes from changing lives for the better. My job doesn't immortalize me. The keys in my life achieved immortality by pushing me to live a life worth remembering. My parents and family were my keys. So was the University of Rhode Island, Christiane Amanpour, Anderson Cooper. And now I do what I do so others will not forget those who would otherwise be forgotten. And today, you'll leave here knowing at least something about who Leka was, a beautiful child spending a day at daycare when the unimaginable struck. And perhaps you'll spare a thought for the girls from Nigeria who are still suffering. You'll smile when I show you a picture of Monley, the boy who survived being buried for 5 days. He's in school now, and he is thriving. So my message to you, find your keys and then become one. Don't fear change. Accept your glorious metamorphosis now as you graduate from the University of Rhode Island and in the future. Embrace it, even if it means you have to start all over again and go get coffee for somebody or you get their shoes out of their office, which I've had to do. It's been said that when we change ourselves, we've already begun to change the world. And I hope whatever you do with your life, when you leave this quad, that you'll immortalize yourself by becoming the key in other people's lives, in whatever craft or profession or path you choose. And I hope you'll honor in some way the lives and the memories of the downtrodden, the persecuted, the oppressed, to help those around you to flourish, to thrive, and to blossom. You'll change their world, and they will remember you for it. Become the key to immortality. Live a life worth remembering. Congratulations, class of 2017.